Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us for our latest World Horse Welfare Wednesday webinar. And you are joining us by Zoom, you know that, and we're just going to mark time, a very short time until we get our viewers on Facebook Live. As before, if you've joined us by Zoom, you know the drill. You can join in. We've got one poll question tonight. You'll be able to join in on that. You've also got the Q&A function and the chat function, so you can use both. And a very good evening now to people joining us by Facebook Live for the latest World Horse Welfare Wednesday webinar. Tonight, we're talking about gut bugs. No gut, no horse. Why gut bugs are essential for optimum health and behaviour. And I'm delighted that this topic gets very little coverage, we believe, but it's our feeling that that is going to change. And I think that in many ways, the change will start tonight because we have Amber Batson and Joe Hockenhull joining us. And I think, through Amber's going to give us a 30-minute presentation to start with. And then Amber and Joe, we've got a number of sort of structured questions. And then part three, the most important part in many ways, is the way we open up to you to ask your questions. If you're joining us by Zoom, then please, please, please do use the Q&A function. By all means, use the chat function to chat amongst yourselves, but use the Q&A function to ask questions. And remember, you can upvote questions. If there's a question there you like, please do upvote them. If you're joining us by Facebook, please put those questions in the comments function and we'll be able to take them there too. So it's very much a two-way conversation. So if you're joining us on Facebook Live, do share the live video. And remember that tonight's webinar and all the other webinars we've run ever since June 2020 in the midst of the pandemic, remember that, are on our World Horse Welfare Education Facebook page. We are running these series of webinars through until the beginning of May. We'll have a pause for the summer and then we'll be back in the winter again. Apologies, that's Northern Hemisphere terminology. But if you've got something you would like us to cover in a future webinar, then please do email us at education@worldhorsewelfare.org. The next webinar is in 3 weeks' time. I assume that's correct, but we'll put a sign up in the chat function shortly. Making an end-of-life decision, when is the right time? An equally important topic. And there we'll be joined by veterinarian Suzanne Green and one of our own World Horse Welfare field officers, Penny Baker. And we'll place a link up there for you to sign up on that. So now, before we get any further, I'm going to share my screen if I can do that properly. I do struggle on this for those of you who regularly attend. So this is where you are. I hope you find yourself in the right webinar series. No gut, no horse. Why gut bugs are essential for optimum health and behavior. So if you're using us, join us by Facebook, you can only put your answer in the comments function. If you're joining us by Zoom, you'll be able to get on and respond to this directly. How important do you think gut health is in relation to behavior and learning in your horse? 4 options there, from very important to not related. This is not a test, we just want to get a feel for your thoughts. So it's either very important, quite important, not very important, or not related. And whilst you're going to have a think about that, I'm going to introduce you to Amber, who will be very well known to many of you, and has qualified initially from the RVC in 1999 and now has a wealth of experience and interest in animal welfare, but also in understanding our animals and animal behavior. And so it's delighted to have Amber with us. As you know, I always ask our panelists and our speakers to provide a quirky fact. This one I think you'll quite enjoy. She once performed an enucleation on a porcupine pufferfish who had developed glaucoma after an incident with another fish. I went to veterinary school. We never learnt, as far as I'm aware, how to diagnose glaucoma in a fish. Amber will be able to tell us, which hugely helped her understanding of pain in non-mammal species. What a fascinating sideline to have. So it's brilliant to have you, Amber. And before I'm going to hand over to you, I hope everyone's had a quick chance to look at that poll question. So Basil, if you can give us the answer to that poll question. Well, it of course slightly leading, but it's very good to see, and I'm sure Amber and Joe will pick up on it during the discussion, the fact that over 80% of you think it is very important. But does that relate to change in our behaviour, in how we feed and manage our horses to ensure that it does have optimum benefit to their behaviour and learning? So we're really interesting to find out about that. So I'm going to stop my sharing, and Amber, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Rolly. Hopefully you can see my screen okay.
All good to go.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, yeah, I'm delighted to be invited to talk on this topic this evening. Going to try my absolute utmost best to keep it to around 30 minutes. Any of you who've heard me speak before will know what a challenge that may be. Yeah, I mean, we often say, actually, don't we, in the equine industry, no foot, no horse. That's the real phrase. But actually, the foot is affected by the gut, and the gut really does dictate everything pretty much about our horse's health and potentially behavior. So I'm sure most of us know that the gut is so important. We're aware of diseases, you know, like colic, and how, you know, horrific that kind of problem can be, you know, and we may, of course, even sadly get fatalities from that type of gut disease. We might know how debilitating things like inflammatory bowel disease can be in horses, worm burdens, of course, perhaps stomach ulcerations. You know, but do we really know why? Why is it when the gut isn't working at 100%, it causes such significant problems? Well, where we kind of are now in human medicine, and we're starting to get in veterinary medicine more and more now, is this understanding about the bugs that live in the gut. They are their own separate community. It's like literally another universe in there, realistically. There are trillions of bugs in the horse's gastrointestinal system. You know, when we think about dogs and humans, they've got, you know, like the horse, a single stomach, but they've got a short piece of small intestine, relatively short large intestine, and then we're at the bum end. Whereas, of course, we all know that in the horse, we've got this incredibly complicated gastrointestinal structure with, yes, one stomach, but then a really long piece of small intestine broken down into different parts. And then we hit this cecum, in this blind ending sac, in a way that's this fermenting vat based on the right-hand side of the horse. And then that feeds into this huge large colon, which in its own right is divided into a number of different sections. So we might know that, but do we appreciate that within that is this alternative universe of gut bugs? And they're not just bacteria, although perhaps predominantly they are bacteria, but there is also fungi in there. There is another totally different type of bug called archaea, and the dreaded word viruses. But, you know, viruses can be good as well as bad. This total community we refer to as the intestinal microbiota. So, you know, if we ever see IM on a gut bug slide, then that's what we mean, that the gut bugs, the microbiota that live in the intestines. We appreciate in the horse, because they are hindgut digesters, that's where they do the majority of their extraction of nutrients and calories, that horses are particularly dependent on their cecum, that blind ending sac that is a fermenting vat, but also then as it extends into the right ventral colon and beyond. And, you know, horses are amazing in their ability to extract nutrition and calories from pretty much nothing. And don't many of us know that, and of course struggle with that? You know, how many of us have equines who we say can put on weight by eating air? You know, they are one of the best converters of plants into calories on this planet, you know, and actually that brings with it a whole host of problems. They convert that plant material predominantly into short chain fatty acids, and it's the gut bugs that are doing that, mostly in the cecum and large intestine. But that's not all they're doing. You know, they are beyond life, not only because they are therefore fully responsible for converting, you know, the plant diet of the equine into calories and nutrition, but they also impact on health in a variety of other ways. And we are starting to really understand now how they impact on behavior. So how come? How so? When we think about these strange little chaps living in the gut, what do? Well, we've said they are responsible for breaking down food that comes into the gut into its various compounds, and that those compounds can then be absorbed across the gut wall into the bloodstream to provide various calories and nutrition in different forms. But they also make vitamins, and the gut bugs are responsible for a huge amount of that. They also make chemicals that affect the gut tissue. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about that in a moment in respect to some of the main chemicals we know that they are making. But it's a huge area that we're just starting to get more and more into in all species, mammal species, but the horse as well. So they affect gut tissue activity, and they affect brain activity as well. Then there's a variety of chemicals that the gut bugs are making from the food that's given to them. I often refer to gut bugs, whether that's really an appropriate thing to do or not, as chefs, really. And we're providing them with ingredients, and those chefs in their kitchen are churning out these different recipes. And they can combine different ingredients in slightly different ways, and perhaps the cooking mechanism that they use within themselves varies to provide a huge array of different products. And then those products can be absorbed into the bloodstream, or can have knock-on effects on other parts of the body and affect all sorts of parts, you know, of our living being. One of the huge things that happens is that the gut bugs are responsible for stimulating and influencing our immune system. So we might think about the immune system as actually really coming from the bone marrow. The bone marrow is producing, you know, our main amounts of white blood cells. Now, white blood cells, of course, being the ones that deal with bacteria and viruses that come into our body that we don't want to be there. But also white blood cells are very much involved in inflammatory responses as well, as are other chemicals. And so, you know, all of these immune parts, which may be made by tissues like the bone marrow, are actually switched on and off by the gut bugs. You know, we have something called gut-associated lymphoid tissue, which is the immune system within our gut. And activation of that tissue has a huge role to play in what cells made by the bone marrow get turned into. So they're really important chaps, or ladies, whatever we'd like to say. They also promote fat storage. Maybe that's not something we really want them to do, but of course, from the equine's perspective, of course, we all need fat in our body. And if food is in surplus, then it's a great time to have it and hang on to it, particularly perhaps, as we're all very familiar with, at times when we have peak growth of plants, which of course, you know, for many of us will be the summer. And, you know, that's a time where, gosh, if there is an excess of nutrition available, well, let's keep that, because that won't always be available as we hit autumn, winter, colder times, different weather times. Then of course plant availability might become incredibly low, and we would rely on that storage of nutrition to get us through those periods. They do other things which we're not going to have time to go into today, but they impact on nerve growth as well, because again, they're involved in producing and stimulating various chemicals that impact on our nerves. They impact on our bone density as well. And they also can have an impact on various medications. And of course, that's probably not what they evolved to do, but certain medications that are given to equines or other species may have significant effects on the gut bugs, or might actually be broken down and dealt with by the gut bugs. They also, because of their impact on medications and bone density and nerve growth factors and other chemicals, impact on pain perception as well. So, you know, they play this enormous role. I thought I'd give a good example of that as a crossover really between health and behaviour in relation to how gut bugs are involved in managing a particular building block that comes in through the diet. So some of you may have heard of tryptophan before. Tryptophan is an essential amino acid. That means it needs to come into the body through the diet. That's the essential bit. An amino acid means that they are in effect a building block for protein structures. So tryptophan comes into the horse's diet quite readily through a whole variety of plants that they can consume. And once that tryptophan is being released by the gut bugs from the food source they've come in, from the plant themselves, it can go into one of three pathways. So tryptophan is a building block for serotonin. Serotonin is 90% of serotonin in a mammal's body is believed to be in the gut itself. That's a huge amount. And why do we need that serotonin in our gut? Well, we need that serotonin in our gut because serotonin is absolutely key to normal gut motility, the movements of the muscles that surround our gut that create these waves to keep the food matter moving through it. But also those muscles can cool down as well and create a kind of mechanical mixing up, mix up those ingredients that are available to those chefs. And serotonin is hugely involved, if not solely really responsible in a way for that gut motility. But serotonin does other things, and the 10% of serotonin that exists outside of the gut in an animal's body is found in a lot of different locations, but a lot of it is found in the brain, and serotonin is one of the brain's key messaging chemicals. It has more than 15 different receptors in the brain. It's found in multiple different locations across the brain. So it's clearly hugely important as a chemical messenger. The gut serotonin, so that 90% that's made in the gut and is made from tryptophan by the gut bugs, cannot get into the brain. Okay, so this is what's become a really fascinating area about gut bugs and brain and function across brain and body, is that how is it then that that 90% of serotonin made in the gut influences the brain? Well, probably in at least 2 or 3 different ways. One is that depending on how much is made in the gut, then we should have some tryptophan that's not being used up by those chefs, not being used by those gut bugs, which will enter the bloodstream. So some tryptophan is left alone by the gut bugs, gets into the circulation, and that tryptophan can cross the blood-brain barrier, get into the brain, and be made into serotonin in the brain tissue. And once serotonin's in the brain tissue, we know it has a whole variety of functions. It acts as an anti-anxiety chemical, it acts as a anti-aggression chemical, plays a huge role in appetite, plays a big role in sleep, pain perception, many, many different things. Our mood, of course, many of us will have heard of serotonin because we often target that chemical with antidepressants. Like Prozac. Prozac is fluoxetine, that's the real drug name of it, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And those antidepressants are focused on increasing the amount of serotonin in our brain, or at least keeping it present in our brain for longer so it can carry out more functions and act as a mood enhancing medication. So serotonin has a big role to play in our positive mood. So tryptophan can be made into serotonin, but tryptophan can also be made into indoles and into something called kynurenine. And I'm not going to bore you with any more detail about that. You can ask about it if you want to, but there's plenty of references coming later you can follow if you find that fascinating. Indoles and kynurenine particularly feed into the immune system stimulation side of things and the inflammatory pathway side of things. So we very much need tryptophan to be converted into its different kind of outcomes in the right ratios. If we end up with perhaps too much on the indole or too much on the kynurenine side compared to serotonin, then not only do we have overactivation of the immune system, but we also have an underproduction of serotonin, which of course may mean problems in the gut, problems with appetite, problems with sleep, problems with mood, problems with aggression, and all sorts of issues. So tryptophan being converted in the right ratios to the right chemicals really matters. And who makes that decision? The gut bugs make that decision. And the health of those gut bugs and which bugs are present in an individual and how healthy they are and how healthy that individual is and how stressed they are significantly impacts on what happens to that tryptophan. So one of the things we do know has a significant impact on tryptophan's conversion is stress. And that is something that we need to consider a lot more in the equine side when we think about the sources of stress that we'll come on to in a moment. And we can sometimes also get a positive feedback as well. If we start to produce too much inflammation, too much overstimulate the immune system in some way, then that its own right can become a stressor. Unpleasant experiments that have been done on rats and laboratory rodents have shown if you inject them with inflammatory, their own inflammatory chemicals, but in a slightly excessive way, it causes huge changes in their behavior. It can make them in particular really quite aggressive, show things like repetitive behaviors, what we may call stereotypies, and all sorts of problems. So once we get too much in the way of inflammation, because perhaps stress has affected the gut bugs, we can actually get out of balance quite quickly. It isn't just serotonin. We also have a fair amount of dopamine, which is made in our guts, and dopamine impacts on our reward circuitry, our movement circuitry, our focus and attention. We also know that GABA is made in the gut by gut bugs. GABA is our main inhibitory, calm electricity down, keep electricity in the brain under control, and even noradrenaline. So, there's a whole host of chemicals which have an effect on the health of an individual, but also on their behavior. Why have I got a rhinoceros walking across the hill on my slide? Because my PowerPoint doesn't have an animated moving horse. And the rhinoceros is the closest evolutionary relative we have to the horse in terms of alternative species, because they are an odd-toed ungulate. So the rhinoceros has 3 toes, ungulate meaning, of course, predominantly grazer with some browsing, and the rhinoceros is an odd-toed ungulate, just like the horse. So there's particularly the white rhinoceros has an awful lot of similarities to the horse, both in terms of their gut anatomy, but also even their social structure. But anyway, that's a subject for another day. If things get out of balance in terms of perhaps inflammatory chemicals, as I just talked about, and not producing enough serotonin, what sorts of things might we see? What might become the behavioural outcomes for an equine? Well, it will impact on their anxiety. And they typically, with more inflammation and less serotonin, will become more anxious, more fearful. We will see a change in irritability, so a change in emotional control, and that might even become an intolerance of frustrations, but it might also even become aggression. We've had some interesting specific work done in the equine. These 2 references I've put there, Destres and Bulmer. There are some others, but they were just 2 easy ones to pick on, where we've actually looked at horses being given slightly different diets, in these cases predominantly increasing the starch in an equine diet, and then observing the gut bug change and observing the behavioural change in the equine. And in both of those pieces of research, that the significant change that was noted by just shifting the starch levels to being a bit higher in a horse's diet was increased vigilance. So what's that? Kind of paying an awful lot more attention, worrying about new stimuli that are coming into the environment. So we know that behavioural change that may come from subtle, sometimes diet changes, because that impacts on the gut bugs and therefore what recipes the cooks turn out with their ingredients, is a real truth in the equine themselves. It can affect their speed of responses as well, can make them much quicker, although can potentially also lead to withdrawal and depression in some circumstances. Gut bugs are being shown nowadays to have a real impact on learning capacity. Research has shown that if we minimize gut bugs, and we haven't done that in the equine specifically, but been done in other laboratory species, if we minimize gut bugs by giving them antibiotics or breeding them in a specific way to have much lower gut bugs present, then they find it much harder to make new memories once they've made a memory in a particular situation. So let's say that you've learnt that a particular situation is scary or threatening. The less you have gut bugs available, the fewer you have, or the less diverse they are in your gut, then you tend to find that you can't move on from that memory. You can't learn something new. Sorry, I'm just trying to sort out something that's on my slide. Repetitive behaviours. You know, we know that we get a fairly high number of abnormal repetitive behaviours in the equine. So what we perhaps used to call stereotypies or vices. So wind sucking, crib biting, stall walking, that sort of thing. We're starting to appreciate now that repetitive behaviours may be significantly affected by gut bug populations. And perception of pain as well. Perception of pain, you know, perhaps because of serotonin, is very much affected by the state of our gut bugs. How did the bugs get there? I'm going to whiz through this. They start getting into the gut of an equine when that equine is a fetus inside mum. So there's some crossing from mum and her blood into via the placenta into the fetus. But the main kind of colonization of the gut occurs at birth. And whilst it's not a pleasant thing to consider, the vagina of mum contains a lot of different bugs, predominantly bacteria, but also there's yeasts, archaea, fungi, etc. And that's the initial colonizing population. Of course, we hopefully all appreciate that foals need to have that all-important first milk, colostrum, and colostrum is rife, of course, with these raw bacteria and other bugs. They continue then to drink milk. You know, normally in a natural environment, they will do that until they are at least 8 to 9 months of age. But if mum isn't having another foal that year, you know, they may go on to continue to suck from mum until they're well over a year, sometimes even 2 years or older has been reported in the wild where mum hasn't had any other foals. And when they're sucking from mum, of course, they might not always be getting an awful lot of milk. There's a whole kind of security thing and an attachment and bonding thing that comes from sucking on mum, but also, of course, they're sucking her skin, and her skin is loaded with bugs. What her bugs are is affected by her stress in pregnancy, if she has been given any medicine in pregnancy, or perhaps even while she's lactating, and of course whether or not she did give birth vaginally. Caesareans are not very common in equines, but are far more common in other species like humans and dogs, and we know it has a big role on the gut bug population. But you know, foals are eating, aren't they, grass. They start ingesting plants in the first week of life, and whilst they're still at that stage reliant on milk, their transition onto a plant-based diet starts really early, and so they're also consuming these bugs from the soil. They get them from contact with others. You know, we have new evidence now that horses that are within a herd share an awful lot of the same bugs, mutually grooming one another, licking elements of one another. Even perhaps that thing when we see horses come together nostril to nostril and sniffing one another. Yeah, that's about identifying one another. Of course it is picking up pheromones, but there's also the potential for bugs to be transferred at that time as well. And a very new piece of research that's literally just been published has been looking at free-ranging equine bugs by studying their poo and what bugs are present. and comparing that to the bugs in poo of domestic horses. And the lead author, Ang, said that there's a significant impoverishment in the domestic horse in their gut bugs, suggesting that diet, antibiotic exposure, and hygiene are the likely factors. You know, we keep horses away from soil, we cover them in rugs, we don't let them roll, we don't perhaps let them mutually groom with one another in the same way. That's going to have a significant impact. What keeps those chefs happy? What can we do to make the chefs in the kitchen happy? Well, we've got to give them the right ingredients, that's for sure. And I'm sure many of us appreciate that. You know, high fiber, low sugar, low starch diet is absolutely crucial for good gut bug populations. But movement's really, really important. And we've got to remember that horses evolved to eat and move. You know, they move a hoof on average every 5 to 30 seconds when they're not in their resting state. And Williams was the lead author on 2 pieces of research done 2011, 2015, which looked at measuring the gut motility of the domestic horse when they were put into kind of restrictive circumstances. So in the 2011 piece of research, as an example, measured gut motility in horses when they were at pasture compared to when those same horses stood in a stable for a period of time, and showed a significant and really, really substantial reduction in gut motility and movement when the horse was stood in the stable. I think, you know, as a vet myself, you know, of course, I think most of us know there's a huge risk factor in stabling horses and restricting horses' movement in terms of colic. You know, colic is, of course, sometimes seen out at grass and in horses that live out at pasture 24/7, but far more common in horses that are having some level of restriction in their environment. And really, that's one of the things that Williams was able to demonstrate. Perhaps that's why. What they weren't looking at, but we've started to appreciate more, is it's all tied in with the gut bugs. The gut, the blood flow to the gut, which also keeps those bugs happy by providing them with oxygen, very, very much affected by the movement of the horse. So horses need to move all the time, pretty much all the time anyway. And if they're not doing that, then that will impact on those gut bugs. I've mentioned stress already. Absolutely, stress makes gut bugs unhappy. Elevated levels of cortisol, the longer term stress chemical, aldosterone, prolactin, because cortisol is not the only stress player. All of those stress chemicals have a significant impact on gut bugs. One of the reasons why, as we understand it now, is that persistently elevated stress chemicals like cortisol stop the cells in the gut, which normally are glued together, which form this tight junction so that the bacteria, which need to be in there, those chefs need to be in the middle of the gut to do their job, stops them getting into the circulation. But long-term stress actually weakens that junction. It makes the glue unsticky. And now even our nice gut bugs start to get in between the cells, triggers an inflammatory response. And that inflammatory response is then replicated throughout the body as inflammation, further exacerbates stress and causes all sorts of problems for the horse. So low stress is really important in terms of gut bugs. And of course, the horse evolved to live at times in a stressful environment. You know, our zebra, of course, is occasionally going to be ambushed by a pride of lions, but it's the ability to do something about stress, which is so important. If you can take action to hopefully remove yourself from that situation or try and appease the situation if it's a social threat, then you will be able to get your stress levels under control. Where you're restricted in your options of how to manage your stress, there will be a more significant impact. So, of course, pain is a big problem for horses, and we know, sadly, that a lot of domestic horses have pain in their body. That triggers stress response. Other forms of ill health, like hepatitis, infections, those sorts of things. But, of course, fear, not being able to assess and respond to potential threats, maybe because you're restrained in some way. You know, maybe you're kept in a very small paddock with electric fencing. Maybe you're not able to move away from the horse that's stabled next door to you, who's constantly making threats to you over the wall. All those sorts of things. being socially isolated, not being able to make positive social associations and bonds. Transportation, environmental changes, lots of things, of course, cause stress. And I'm sure we'll probably discuss some of them in our Q&A. Horses are good runners. You know, they evolve long bones and, you know, wonderful muscles to move those bones fast, and excellent lungs to have a really wonderful oxygen capacity, but they only do it for really short periods of time. Horses are sprinters. They are not endurance runners. And as soon as a horse is running, we're diverting blood from the gut to the muscle. And they didn't evolve to do that for more than probably several minutes at any time. So when we have horses that are doing fast exercise for, you know, probably beyond 10, 20 minutes, then we're actually starting to deprive some of those gut bugs of oxygen. And that really starts to make life very, very tricky for the horse and their gut bug population. Sleep, you know, movement's really important, but you need sleep too, you know, and we have a growing body of evidence that sleep actually also itself has a big positive effect on gut bugs. Horses only need a really little bit of sleep. They only need about 4 hours in total across all of 24. And if you get more than that, that isn't beneficial to you. So there's an optimum amount for every species. We know in horses that it's gained best in positive social company. So, you know, a stable, predictable herd where you're familiar with everyone, you're not threatened by anyone. Evidence that has shown that horses prefer comfortable surfaces. They don't lie down as well or as long on things like rubber matting, hard surfaces. They like open spaces. And of course, they will struggle to lie down for appropriate periods of time or even stand up to sleep comfortably if they're in pain. So I've given you a little reference on that slide from Thielen, which is a study that's been done in the Netherlands about kind of healthy gut bug populations in equines, if you're interested. Let's start wrapping it up then, really, so we can get into some questions. You can take the horse out of the field, but can you take the field out of the horse? You know, and I think this is a really, really important question when we're thinking about equine welfare. You know, and of course, there may be good reasons, particularly in certain climates, why leaving a horse in a field. I mean, look at this image of two mares. They're both obese. They're in a large field with lots of grass. It's not going to be appropriate. They're going to get sick. And, you know, but there is a balance for them. If we take them out and perhaps they don't have access to any grass at all, how are we going to manage that so that they still can move relatively freely? They can still have positive associations socially and do all the things that we just said their gut bugs need to be able to do. You know, so for their health and behavior, you know, then we've got to think about how we can manage them if grass is a complicated situation for them. But of course, that's impacted upon by the land and what state the land's in and how we're going to manage that. And it's also impacted on our behaviour and our expectations and attitudes. Hippocrates, I think it was something like 2,500 years ago, said that all disease begins in the gut. And wasn't that an amazing thing to say so long ago? And it's true. We know that equine metabolic syndrome, which has become so common, sadly, in many parts of the world in horses nowadays, is a complex disorder, but it affects the burning of calories and fuel stores, which happens alongside elevated levels of inflammation. The gut bugs we know get change in their balance during EMS, which impacts on insulin's function, and of course creates this risk of hormonal, but it's not a sex hormone, you know, it's other hormones like insulin, etc., induced laminitis. It's a big problem, you know, but it's definitely involving the gut bugs. So we have to start looking at these medical disorders with a more multimodal approach. Colic, gastritis, gastric ulcer syndrome are all significantly impacted by changes in gut bugs. But it may surprise you to know that recent research is showing that osteoarthritis, because it's an inflammatory disorder, often has gut ill health or dysbiosis, we call it, imbalance, somewhere in its jigsaw puzzle of causes. We've started to look at sweet itch in horses, and atopy, which are more generalized allergic itch, and severe equine asthma, all of which, of course, are debilitating inflammatory disorders in the equine from a gut bug population. And so far, we're actually finding that horses that have those diseases don't have substantially different gut bugs to horses that don't have those conditions. But the sort of level of understanding at the moment is that it's probably because it's when the individual is young and first developing their immune system that the gut bug inflammatory kind of links are so important. That perhaps we are, if the gut bugs aren't in balance when we're early on in life and we're initially stimulating and laying down our immune system, that's where the problem begins. So what can we do about it? You know, aside from, you know, obviously managing them appropriately with stress and you know, diet and those sorts of things. What about probiotics? Well, sadly, pieces of research have shown that probiotics in equines are not really as beneficial as we would like. There is a little bit of evidence that we might be able to impact on the stamina of exercising equines by using probiotics, but it's fairly small. But in terms of general overall health and behavior, so far we've had limited effect. And it's probably because the horse has such a complicated, huge gut that when we give something like a probiotic, which there is bacteria into the mouth of the horse, it's got to get somewhere. And if it's got to get to the cecum and the large hindgut, how's it going to do that? Because it's going to get affected by the stomach and the small intestine on the way. We have had a little bit of research that shows probiotics in foals may be more useful, but overall that the better thing might be to take poo from another horse and put it into the gut of the horse we're trying to improve, and what we call fecal microbiota transplantation. But in adult horses, we've got a similar problem. If we do it by stomach tube into the stomach, it doesn't seem to be very effective. If we put a tube up their bum and put it into their rectum and the end of the large colon, again, it just doesn't get there. Might be more beneficial in foals is where the research is. Prebiotics, which is the food for the gut bugs. Postbiotics, which is the chemicals the bugs themselves produce. Could they be more beneficial? Maybe, but we don't have enough data on that in horses as yet. So, millions of bugs affecting health and behavior. Prevention is always better than cure. If we can do better at considering the health and stress of mares in pregnancy and at the time of birth, that is a hugely crucial step in getting every foal off to the best start. And of course, then thinking about the attachment and how long they spend sucking from mum, and the age of weaning is a really important part in that too. Meeting physical in terms of diet and movement and social contact and sleep, and emotional needs, being able to make choices in the environment, move away from threats, minimizing stressors, is probably our best role, our best potential in supporting the gut bugs. The cooks need the right ingredients, so a high fiber, low sugar, low starch, but trickle fed diet, you know, that horses need to eat 12, 14, 16 hours. But I'm thinking also about the variety in that, you know, the variety within the plants, that will impact on the gut bugs, and also access to soil, you know, that's also a really important factor. Hopefully, if we can apply a more multimodal approach to health and behavior, then that is benefiting the gut bugs, which of course then is impacting on the horse's welfare. I've made you a list of the references I've included, because some of you might be more kind of geeky and science orientated than others, and you might enjoy those. So you're very welcome to screenshot this slide. It of course will be available on the on YouTube and through the Facebook page, so you can come back and watch it again and screenshot this if you would like to access those references. And other than that, it's definitely time for me to hand back to Roly with just a little mini plug, which is, you know, I started to talk about it a little bit a few years ago when I wrote my chapter for equine behaviour in mind. And so if you're kind of interested in thinking more about the behaviour and husbandry elements of horses and how that might impact on areas like gut bugs, then that is a good book as a good starting point. Thank you for listening. I will look forward to our chat.
Amber, thank you. Wow, that was brilliant. God, we got so much to talk about. I have to say, when you started, I'm so glad you cleared up the white rhino situation. I did then try and go and Google for an animation of a horse, and I couldn't find one. But there's a challenge for everyone. And I don't know if anyone else was listening to Radio 2 this morning with Vernon in for Zoe, but he this obviously in the UK. He had Gordon Ramsay on. I wonder what Gordon Ramsay would think of gut bugs as chefs. They didn't
I'm sure
cover
he'd
that
have an opinion, there's no doubt.
Yeah, he certainly would, wouldn't he? Brilliant. Now, listen, I'm going to just share my screen and there we go. And I'm going to introduce you to Joe, who's now going to join the panel with Amber, which is great. Who, Joe initially qualified, I think, or graduated from Reading with a degree in zoology, and has been at the animal behaviour and welfare team at Bristol for over 10 years. And she's a member also of the Equine Behaviour and Training Association. And maybe, Joe, you could just tell us in a little bit about what EBTA does. I love Joe's quirky fact, which I don't approve of at all, actually, because she shouldn't have to be chaperoned, but she used to take students to a local cat and dog rescue centre as part of their degree course. The first time she did it, she ended up with a dog and managed to convince her colleagues that they all needed some cats. After that, they always sent someone with her who had a strict orders not to let her go off with any of her own and adopt anything else. Well, no, we're going to make sure that that person doesn't visit when Joe comes to visit a World Horse Welfare Centre, and we can certainly find a couple of ponies that will go home with her, which is excellent. So thank you for that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can have the team up. And cool, we've got so many questions. Remember, on Zoom, if you're on Zoom, you can upvote. Lots of questions coming in there. And please, if you're on Facebook, put in the comment section and we'll get them across. So Joe, obviously Amber has covered so much, but she talked a bit about the importance of movement. And when with so many horses, either in livery yards where there's not much sort of space, or in medical conditions have recent laminitis, what options do we have to increase their step count and help their bug activity?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So we're all sort of brought up, and you have your hay net for your horse if it's in the stable, and you hang it in one place, and then the horse will just stand there in exactly the same spot until it finishes its hay net. So it's really thinking about how we can provide that in a different way to allow the horse to move around. So perhaps having smaller but different hay nets in different locations, or different types of sort of high fibre, obviously low starch, low forage, but different forage options in different places, so the horse can move itself around its environment to get its legs moving, and also obviously make those microbiome happy.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you, Joe. Amber, if ponies have had laminitis, and you mentioned this, or suffer from EMS, and grazing must be restricted or even prevented, how can we support their gut bugs?
Yeah, I think it's obviously it's always a challenge, isn't it? And we know now that using things like probiotics and stuff probably aren't going to be effective enough. So I think we've just got to go back to focusing on their needs. Clearly, initially, if we're laminitis or post-laminitis, getting on top of their pain is important, because if they're in pain, then that will have that will increase their stress, and that will have a negative impact on their gut bugs. So it's, we do have to think about using pain management in an effective way. But beyond that, if we're pretty sure they're comfortable, and we create that comfort by medicines, perhaps with some sort of protective foot covering or footage underneath the horse, with the softness of the ground, then we're just back to really making sure that they've got companionship. Can they be with another equine? It's so common for people to think, oh yeah, no, but I can't keep another horse in 24/7 to keep this one company. It's not fair on the other. But you might be able to have a rotation. You can do what I call hospital visits, where horses actually come and maybe they're just loose on the yard close by, so they can still interact over the door. There are lots of ways of providing social contact, and don't ever forget how important a sense of smell is to the horse. So you can also provide the smell of companions. You know, I get people to do weird, bizarre things. Many of you might have heard of me as a bit of a poo obsessed person, but you know, you can collect some poo of your horse's favorite companion and put it in the corner of their box or on the corner of their yard, so that they've still got access to the smell of their companion as well when the actual companion's not around. You know, there's lots of ways we can meet companionship better. Movement, as Joe's just addressed, you know, through scatter feeding and lots of mini stations rather than just one. You know, they are, and making sure, of course, that we're meeting the most appropriate dietary needs. Straw's receiving a lot more attention again now, I think, with EMS and laminitis, which is fantastic. Straw, you know, horses can extract calories from anything. So, you know, literally, as we say, the air. So just, you know, we can't just give them ad lib straw, but more recent studies have been showing that if we can replace 50% of their hay diet with straw, then we are providing a much better fiber source for the gut bugs, and also allowing them to have more to eat because there's less nutrition and calories available from that. So, you know, that's a really interesting thing to consider. People get worried about impactions and colic with straw. There's no real evidence base to show that that's likely to happen. I've treated a lot of impacted colics, and I promise you almost all of them have been on shavings beds and not on straw. So it's not really a straw thing, but of course, if the horse is barely moving, maybe they're not chewing their food well, then of course it might be a concern. But generally, if there's a bit of movement around a large stable or a yard, you know, or certainly if there's a, you know, crew yard or some sort of turnout, then you know, using straw can be a really good beneficial thing to do too.
Brilliant, love it. And as ever, we've got people joining us from literally all over the world, lots from the United Kingdom. We always get someone from Land's End. Wonderful to see Land's End get a mention again. But across Europe, Finland, Sweden and Luxembourg. Got people watching in Canada and in Australia, amongst other countries. So brilliant to have such a wide range. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for all these questions. Remember, some of you aren't playing ball. Remember, I said chat was for chat. No questions in the chat on Zoom. Put them into the Q&A, please, if you could, or onto the comments function of Facebook. Joe, then, we've talked, Amber mentioned, you know, the challenge with overweight horses. How can we best balance the need for a healthy gut with the need of a horse to lose weight?
Yeah, and this is where it gets interesting as well, because the tendency is you go, oh my God, my horse is overweight. I'm just going to change everything immediately and try and restrict their diet, try and get them to lose weight. But it's sort of like Amber was saying, the gut bugs can't really cope that well with a massive change in circumstances. So it's make any changes you're doing gradual. Think about the rest of the horse's life. So again, not compartmentalizing and just focusing on that weight. Are you meeting their other needs? Are they getting their companionship? Are they having a low stress environment? Have you addressed anything else that's going on? So while it can be so tempting just to, oh my God, I've realized my horse is overweight, I'm going to stick it on a concrete with no access to food. It's trying to reduce that weight with their behavioral needs and keeping their stress as minimal as possible in mind. It's really important.
Yeah, because I just, you know, add to that, you know, we are starting to understand more and more on the obesity side. Obesity is an inflammatory state, you know, and it's so if we have got an unhealthy gut, then and that, as I said, is maybe shifting that tryptophan into inflammatory path rather than serotonin, then we actually are promoting further obesity, and the fat cells themselves start to release inflammatory chemicals, and we also know that they can start to produce stress chemicals like cortisol as well, and it fuels the whole problem. So exactly as Joe said, you know, from a medical perspective, it's just so important that when we think about weight loss in the horse, we don't just go, oh, okay, well, let's bring them off the grass, let's restrict their space so that we can control their diet, and not think about these other sources of stress. Because if we don't address their companionship, their need to move, their appropriate sleep patterns, then you're going to be fighting a losing battle, you know, even on, and I've seen it. And actually I remember, Roly, many years ago, a pony that we dealt with actually as a legal case, you know, who was a hugely obese pony. that came up to Hall Farm after she was given to us by the caregiver because they admitted that they totally failed her needs. And you know, the challenges that we have with that level of obesity, you know, I remember that pony was on a restricted, like a yard, stable and yard turnout for months and hardly lost a kilo. You know, and some horses are far more challenging than others from that perspective. But if we can't address the behavioural needs simultaneously, then we may be adding more fuel to the fire.
Yeah. Comes back to the 3 F's of freedoms, friend and forage, doesn't it? So listen, a couple more questions because we got questions piling up here, which is brilliant. Joe, if you're supporting an owner to work through a behavioural issue with their horse, how often do you consider that the horse's gut may be contributing to the challenging behaviour?
I think this, so I have to admit, like up until a few years ago, I wouldn't have thought about it at all. Just in terms of, you know, you're aware that if an animal is stressed because you feel it yourself, you know that you have gut problems and things can happen. So it's not like we weren't aware of it, but I think really didn't appreciate just what was going on. So for example, we know that stabling can be stressful for some horses, but we didn't necessarily appreciate that it was actually upsetting the gut as well, and all the knock-on effect that was having. So while we were taking, you know, you generally take a very holistic view of the horse's life, you're looking at every single component of it. And part of that might have been addressing things like reducing the stress, you know, emotional stability, like you're addressing the emotional factors, psychological health. Weren't necessarily looking at the gut within that, but because you're sort of looking at the whole horse when you're trying to address the behaviour, it was sort of ticking along under that. But I think now we're all more aware of just the impact that it can have on a horse's welfare and on their general well-being in every other way.
Brilliant. I guess it's a key take-home message from the webinar, isn't it? The fact that actually, and we've heard it from you, Amber, in fact, the breadth of impacts that the gut biome can have is just extraordinary. Now, listen, we've got loads of questions, so we're going to have to be really tight with our answers, team. So first question from Susan. Amber, what's the best way to restore a horse's gut health after a heavy worm burden? Gosh,
really interesting one, isn't it? I think really diet, movement, social contact, really, you know, obviously we've got to make sure that we're giving what cooks there are the best ingredients that we can. It can be complicated depending on what type of gut damage has been done, really, but, you know, making sure that we are on a high fiber diet. It is, however, I just will add one thing to that. If we've got an emaciated or very, very thin horse, a high fiber diet can kill that horse. And that, you know, we get this thing called refeeding syndrome. Now, you know, and I mention it really because particularly with a very international audience, there may be people who are trying to rehabilitate very, very skinny post-worm burden horses after purchasing them at market or something. Super important that we don't just go, okay, well, the best thing to do then is stick them on a really good high fiber diet, because a lot of them will die as a result of that because of metabolic refeeding syndrome. So aside from, you know, if they're not emaciated, if there's been a worm burden, you know, and they're actually in okay body condition, etc., then obviously a higher fiber diet, low starch, low sugar is ideal, but we've got to allow them to move and provide them with appropriate social care.
Yeah, so it's not, you're liable to think it's just about the diet, but a key thing there is picking up on Joe's point, to make changes. You don't make dramatic changes quickly, but also to think non-dietary impacts of way of improving that, which is great. Joe, Trish has asked, what are your thoughts on using a track system to allow horses free access to forage while enhancing opportunities to exercise to get forage?
Yeah, so track systems are great when they work, when you've set them out in a way that works for your land, your particular situation, your finances, your horses. But again, it's making sure that you are meeting all their needs within that they've got somewhere comfortable they can lie down to sleep, they've got the right balance of horses there, and they've got the right amount of forage, the variation, but not too much or too little. So yeah, working out what you're doing and following that is important. And not being, and it doesn't work to pull them out.
Sorry, Joe.
Sorry, I was going to say not being afraid if it doesn't work, to adapt it so it does work for your situation, I think.
And I always like testing, Basil. There is a recent piece of research done around track systems that we might be able to pop in the chat function, just so you're aware of that. Next question from EC. I don't think that's the European Commission, but from EC anyway. Are there specific strategies to improve gut health in senior horses, immune deficiency horses, or horses with Cushing's, arthritis, or with insulin resistance? Amber, I'll fire that one at you.
Yeah, well, that's quite broad, isn't it, with all those different medically things in there. Although,
maybe go on the geriatric horses, the senior horses.
Well, I was going to say, well, actually, there's a common theme though with some of those conditions. When you're talking about arthritis and EMS and laminitis, they've all got itis at the end, and that means inflammation. You know, and so absolutely, the gut bug population isn't healthy. We're going to have that inflammatory issue. But yeah, so I think with focused on the geriatric horse, it's important to recognise if they're starting to develop any medical issues because of that. One good example of that would be Cushing's, obviously. So if they've got Cushing, make sure we are diagnosing the Cushing's and that we're treating it, because otherwise that high level of cortisol, guess what it's doing? Damaging the gut bugs. So essentially we get that cortisol under control as best we can. But then of course, probably the most common thing that affects horses, older horses, is their teeth. You know, so good dental care, absolutely essential. Equine dental technician, you know, proper qualified dental care that's really assessing those teeth. So many hidden little issues in the teeth, you know, which we can miss if we're not in there looking at the teeth properly, probably even under sedation as well. So, you know, we've got to make sure we're doing a really good job with their care. And, you know, I know time is limited, but to not forget their incisors as well, you know, because we are diagnosing, of course, these incisor conditions more and more. And it's really important that we don't just think about the back teeth, we think about the front teeth, because how horses pick up food has a big impact on the whole chewing kind of side of things. So yeah, good dental assessment, high fiber diets. If they can't chew hay, then we can get hay replacement diets, of course, you know, so, you know, making sure that we're using the right kind of high fiber diet for the dentition of the horse, as well as making sure we've diagnosed any other conditions, including pain, of course, and arthritis, etc.
Brilliant, and of course Basil's up to the job. He's found Tamsin Furtado's research, sort of she led on that piece of research, and that's in the chat function. So then EC's questions are really popular. Lots of people have upvoted them. So there's a couple more questions from EC. Joe, how can horse owners measure or assess current levels of gut health and gut bugs?
Oh, this is a good one. On a practical, like, how do you measure it thing, I have no idea, and we'll defer to Amber. I mean, I think there's our ways of looking to it in poo, but I think it's one of those things, like, we can't measure brain chemicals, but we know what we need to do to keep stress levels low. So again, it's maybe you don't have to measure it, but you're keeping your horses, you know, they're having their 3Fs, you're keeping their stress levels low, and through that you can be sort of fairly confident that you're sort of meeting their needs, and those gut biota are happy if you're keeping the rest of them as it should be.
Brilliant. Amber?
Some kind of magic test.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think, you know, I mean, there are tests available to actually look at the biota itself. I'll be honest, I don't think we know enough about that yet. We do know, we have had some research done that has shown that there's very little difference between breeds. So actually it doesn't matter so much if you're a warm blood or a thoroughbred or, you know, an Irish cob. You know, they are very, very similar in their gut bug population. But of course, at the moment, the domestic, we've only just, this ANG paper that I talked about earlier, which has just come out, we haven't looked enough at free-ranging horses yet, because we might know what is common in the domestic horse, but actually that doesn't make it normal. So many domestic horses are exposed to antibiotics, you know, weaned too early, have restrictive diets, restricted space. We might not actually be getting exactly the population of gut bugs that are ideal for the equine. So ANG's new piece of research looking at free-ranging horses and comparing them to domestic horses, making this comment about impoverishment of the gut bugs, means that we need a little bit more research on that so that we know what we're striving for. But of course, making sure they're doing at least 7 or 8, you know, firm poos a day. You know, just looking at the consistency of the poo, making sure it's, you know, there's nice fecal balls, you know, and the number of them across a 24-hour period. You know, that in its own right is a useful, very basic assessment. yes, we might be able to do some laboratory testing on the poo itself, but we don't have all the answers as yet about that. And sometimes it's not what gut bugs are there, but what they are making. So it's not what it's not whether they're Gordon Ramsay or not. I'm not Gordon Ramsay, but I can churn out a really good massager. You know, so what they are making, it actually is more important, and that's what we're understanding in other species. So actually, and that's where we probably need to get to. We need to measure what they're making rather than what bugs they are there. And at the moment, we don't have all those answers, but you know, I think we're getting there now.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Joe, you might want to hand this one over to Amber, but what can horse owners do to promote gut health if the horse needs antibiotics? EC's, you put lots of questions into one question, so I'm just picking out one. But if a horse is on antibiotics, what can you do to support its gut health? Their gut health.
I might have to toss that over to Amber.
You're going to toss that over?
I would just say, basically,
Amber.
I would have just kept everything else, maximising the movement, the friends, the low stress,
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
High fibre diet.
Yeah, no, and I think that's exactly the thing, isn't it, Joe? I mean, from a veterinary point, there is people have talked about giving probiotics, of course, you know, but as we're hearing earlier with Cook's research, etc., there's just no evidence that those bugs that we give them get to the right places in the gut. So I think it is about trying to minimize antibiotic use. So important. That it's the same with anthelmintics, of course, give them a little mention. Wormers have been shown in the horse to have an impact on gut bug populations. So of course, being really strategic with our worming, ideally avoiding worming as much as possible in horses. I'm not saying never worm them, but of course what I'm saying is, you know, use fecal egg counts to assess whether they need worming, and thinking about strategic use of any medications, including antibiotics. I think vets sometimes feel pressurized, by clients that they expect a horse to get antibiotics. And, I've certainly been in that situation, even in the racing yards in particular. Well, it's a course of antibiotics. The important, if we're meeting their needs more, if we were meeting their needs better and they weren't so stressed and their immune systems were healthier because their gut bugs were healthier, they might not have needed the antibiotics in the first place. Yeah. So it's so important that we work on the environment simultaneously, particularly at times when we're giving them medications.
Brilliant. Amber, this is one for you from Jackie. It's made me smile slightly just because I think of the pun, but she's got a young horse which has had health issues, and she and her coach think that it's his behaviour and temperament is being affected by pain in the rear gut. But the vet seems to poo-poo this idea. I just like the pun on that. We are just in the process of having the rear gut microbes tested, but again, the vet thinks the science is not there. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that touches on something I said earlier. I think the vet's probably not wrong, actually. I think it's not that we can't test for the bugs there. And actually, a lot of the research that I've mentioned today has been done on poo in horses and looked at what bacteria are there. But that doesn't mean to say we have all the answers, unfortunately. So, yeah, we can do it. Will it give us all the answers? No. I've seen horses have ulcerative colitis in their large colon, so little ulcers that are present. We think of stomach ulcers, but actually ulcers being present in the large colon is not that uncommon, sadly, in horses. And how do you go diagnosing that? That it's quite hard to diagnose that. It's easy to put a camera down into the tummy of a horse. It's not so easy to go sticking it into the mid to hind gut. You can do that, but it's quite a challenging thing to do. You've obviously got to go in from the side, by the way. We haven't got a tube that's safe long enough to go all the way through the tummy and into the hindgut. So, I think, how would we be making that diagnosis realistically? It really does come down to more kind of ruling out everything else, thinking about the pain aspect, and then, working for a period of time on getting that gut healthy. Using all the things we've talked about, a multimodal approach. Unfortunately, using medications to reduce pain typically falls into the category of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories in horses, like phenylbutazone, bute as we call it, or suxibusone if we're talking about things like Danilon, and they can have an impact on those ulcers that are a negative impact on those ulcers that are in the large colon. Yeah. There are other painkillers available though, and we can do pain trials using other things like paracetamol, perhaps even. There are other medications available. So, keep talking to your vet about it, and if necessary, involve some other vets as well. Ask for a referral to a pain specialist. There's it's not go look for another vet, but it's ask for, well, do you think you could pass the notes on to a specific specialist if necessary.
Brilliant. Excellent. Just so I think, Basil, we've answered that first question there from EC, because we looked at geriatric horse. Elaine has asked us about wild horses, and would it be right to think the variety of gut bugs will be seasonal? Who wants to answer that one?
Yeah,
I know the answer.
There is evidence that it does vary with season.
Yeah.
There you go.
Ranging horses.
Brilliant. Good. And is that research informative at all? Can we draw any conclusions from that to a non-wild horse?
It needs expanding, like many studies. Realistically, we need it to be replicated and expanded. But of course, plants change throughout the whole seasonal year. The soil microbiome changes throughout the year. The movement of the horse changes throughout the year. Horses are actually, of course, remember, a migratory species. And we don't allow them to migrate anymore. So there is this whole seasonality about them, absolutely, that of course definitely will impact on their gut bugs. But of course, those changes are relatively gradual. That means that the changes that occur will happen over many weeks, rather than when we perhaps decide to turn a horse out today because it's now spring and it's dried out and they've been in for the last 5 or 6 months. Substantially different. So it's important to bear that in mind.
Brilliant. Now it's 10 past the hour. We've got a mountain of questions, so we're going to have to be really tight, team. Amber, I think this is possibly a question for you. Would it be possible to do a fecal analysis to understand whether our horse is stressed by a certain activity, such as being transported?
Yeah, interestingly, I mean, I guess technically probably we could. I'm not aware there's any laboratories that offer that that service. But yes, things will change pretty quickly. But yeah, there's no labs offering that. I think we have to go on behavioural assessment.
I think that's the key, isn't it? I mean, even if they could offer it at the moment, we don't know enough about it. So actually just watch that behaviour, because that's such a good measure. Again, Joe, you might want to bat some of these across to Amber, but she loves it. Mary's asked, what are the effects of periodic wormer on gut health and gut flora?
Amber.
Well, like I mentioned it earlier, didn't I? We have got some, in other species with smaller guts, we have got evidence that anti-parasite medication doesn't affect the microflora, but actually in the horse, probably because they have such a huge gut, it does seem, we have got evidence it impacts on them. So, making sure that we are using a strategic worming plan. We've got to get over to the equine population and caregivers that we mustn't just be using a wormer once a year or every month or 4 times a year. We've got to be doing it strategically with fecal egg counts. Of course, we've got saliva tests for things like tapeworm. We've got blood tests potentially for encysted cytostomes. There's lots of different ways of doing it, as well as just being sensible. If the horse has got a good immune system and, for all the reasons we've talked about, then they're actually quite tolerant of most worms. Horses did evolve to live, in existence with worms in their gut, and we must never be thinking about trying to remove all parasites. That's dangerous. Let's make sure that we're using the tests appropriately and then making choices based on those tests.
And if that doesn't convince you, then I can hopefully convince you by anthelmintic resistance is on the rise, and soon none of our wormers will work. So I refer you to the World Horse Welfare webinar on our site about responsible worming, because it is so important. And as someone has just said, can't remember who's just said it, around Bethany said, fecal egg counts are so important. You are so right. Abigail has asked us, is there any research as to how long it takes for the gut bacteria to change to a much healthier biome? I can see
Sorry,
Joe.
We have one study. It was done in New Zealand in the last year or two, which actually looked at horses that were at pasture compared their biome to a group of horses that were stabled for a prolonged period, like many weeks, and who then moved on to the same pasture, in effect, not with the horses, but onto the same bit of grassland. And they measured their biota, and they showed that, of course, the horses that were stabled were substantially different, but they showed once they'd moved to the same type of grazing, that they had the same gut bug population as the long-term pasture kept horses in 4 days.
Right.
That was amazing. Yeah. But that was bacteria. And one of the things that we mustn't lose sight of is right at the beginning of my presentation, I said there are other things hiding in there: fungi, archaea, viruses. And as far as we're able to tell, the fungi and the archaea, they take a lot longer, probably several weeks, maybe. We don't have enough data on it as yet. But, so and this is the thing with doing the biomes on the bacterial growth on the poos as well. It's all very well focusing on the bacteria, but there are other guys in there in that team which are super important. So, it probably are looking at some weeks, but we're not looking at months.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Jo, can long-term stress create lasting damage to the gut?
It can create lasting damage to, I don't know, like particularly the gut. Again, I'm looking at Amber, sorry. But long-term stress can cause a lot of long-term issues for horses. It can be quite difficult to resolve. Amber, sorry.
Sorry, Jo. It's quite a medically topic in a way, isn't it, really? Yes. Yeah, I mean, yes and no, really. The gut is always changing. The gut cells are always changing all the time. So, we can have quite substantial gut damage and still recover from it. But obviously stress does very much impact on the gut bugs, stops them working effectively, creates that leaky gut, those tight junctions to weaken. But, I think what Jo was hinting at there was that also we have stress can create change in things like parts of the brain, like the hippocampus, which is to do with memory formation and part of emotional regulation as well, the limbic system. And so long-term stress can definitely have a substantial negative effect on the brain. And if we end up with a horse who perceives everything as scary and threatening, then of course we're permanently switching on the stress axis, which is permanently continuing to damage the gut. So, does long-term stress have the potential to cause long-term problems in the gut? Yeah, it does, really. Yeah. But I do think there are ways of fixing that for a lot of horses. Post-traumatic stress does exist. I don't have any doubt about that, and some horses will struggle to recover from it. But a lot of horses, are able to, if we can meet those needs. Back to Jo.
Yes, so the 3 F's: keeping stress minimal. And yeah, Amber, you're exactly what I was hinting at in my panicked nodding and waving. Thank you.
Brilliant. Jo, a question here on Facebook. They've said, it makes me wonder if we as humans paid as much attention to our guts and what we eat, we'd be happier or less stressed. But I won't ask you that because I'm sorry. But
I was having exactly the same thought, interestingly, when I was listening to Amber going, maybe I should stop worrying so much about the horses and actually think about what I'm eating and what I'm doing.
But you obviously work, and I appreciate that horses have different guts to most other farm animals, but you work in other species. Any sort of read acrosses or any lessons from other species that might be relevant to equine owners?
For me, because I don't really deal with sort of digest, more like wider scale holistic behaviour stuff. And I think for me, it's like we really underestimate just the impact that these little stresses, these little changes, these sort of change of management, maybe changing the diet, maybe introducing a new surface, whatever, can have on the animal. And I think we are recognising that now a lot more in all animals, not just horses. And I guess, that would be my choosing.
And another one for you, Jo, maybe one for Amber, but Hannah has asked, for healthy gut, is it better to feed hay, haylage, and some Ingrid's asked, or even soaked hay, steamed hay? Is there any indication there?
Should I do that one?
Yes, go on.
Amber, one for you.
I mean, I think, so lots of studies have looked at all sorts of feeds, and we've got a lot of work done on this in the horse specifically, and yet just slightly different diets definitely change the population that exists, or the diversity within the gut. As we've said, high fiber, low sugar, low starch is definitely better overall. Of course, we have to balance that against the activity levels of the horse. You know, if I was to take a racehorse, of course, and feed it, so that's an awful thing to say, but them is what I should have said, feed them you know, a high fiber, you know, low sugar, low starch diet, then they're going to not be able to cope with that level of performance. But we know, you know, and I know because I've worked in racing yards for many years, you know, how common gut related problems are in the racehorse, because we're giving them such high levels of concentrated feed to give them enough energy. We're not looking after their gut bug populations effectively. So huge instance of stomach ulceration, of course, also repetitive behaviors, irritability, emotional instability, pain perception, all lots and lots of things. So, you know, it is a little bit, here's a pun, horses for courses, in terms of, you know, what's going to be the best diet, because we've got to balance the energy requirements of the horse. But we must always remind ourselves that, you know, aside from these elite athletes, where we're probably pushing them really too hard, to be honest, you know, then and when we think about what I said earlier about, you know, diverting blood flow from the gut to the muscles, you know, and how that in its own right causes issues with elite athletes, we're always going to have a problem. But, you know, most horses can extract a huge amount of calories and nutrients from a variety of diets, and some variety in the diet though becomes important too, you know. And so I think, you know, when it's just soaked hay as an example, we know that does not provide enough nutrients, and therefore we should be using a balancer or something alongside that. That would be of course applicable to straw as well. We've got to think about a little bit about variety and about soil acquisition, you know, as well, you know, and it's not just the nutritional aspect of the food, and it's how it's presented, you know, and you know, back to Joe, and you know, making sure it's in little bits and moving around and all that stuff. It is horses for courses in terms of energy levels to a degree, you know, but most of the time, as long as we focus on as high fiber as feasible, and doing the right thing by its behavioural presentation and getting that movement of the horse, then that's really important.
Brilliant. Good attempt to win the analogy or the pun prize, but I'm afraid Jackie with poo-pooing vet is still much better. Joe, a question from Facebook. From a welfare and stress point of view, how important is it that a horse lays down to sleep? My old mare does not lie down to sleep, although she can get up and roll with no trouble.
Yeah, so for horses to get sort of the proper REM sleep, they need to lie down. And it is important. So as Amber said, you know, they don't need massive amount. So it's 4 hours across the course of a day, but they do need for that REM sleep to be lying down in some position. So we used to think it was, you know, full flat out with the legs out. Now they can be sort of sternly recumbent and can get REM sleep that way. But we know from ourselves, we know how irritable and how bad the world looks when we've not had enough sleep. It's not giving the horse that time they need to rest and recharge. And yeah, so from a stress and welfare perspective, I would be worried, and I would be looking into potential causes of pain that are perhaps preventing your mare from lying down. But also, are they definitely not lying down and you've not just missed it? Because I've known a few people that have said their horse doesn't lie down and it does very sneakily where they can't see.
Brilliant. Although right now I go to sleep every night and I really do hope the world is going to be a better place in the morning, and the news doesn't get any better, does it? But there we go. Question from Jenny, Amber. We're running out of time. Can eating poo be a sign of bad gut health?
Yeah, really interesting, isn't it? And you know, it never, I work with dogs a lot too, behaviourally, and coprophagia in dogs is a much more common issue. So we call it coprophagia. Some species eat their own poo naturally. Joe mentioned her rabbit earlier. Was that in this presentation? I think
it's just
the chatty bit.
It's a chat. But anyway, but rabbits eat their poo normally. You know, that's a normal thing for them. It's not for horses. For foals, yes, foals are getting some of the biome from mum, etc., learning what plants mum's eaten by eating. But by the time they're sort of 6 to 8 months old, we're not normally seeing any coprophagia. So in adult horses, it's considered to be an abnormal behaviour. In dogs, also, free-ranging dogs, we do not see dogs eating dog poo. We see them eating a whole variety of others. 30% of their diet's made up of poo of other species, but not dog poo. And yet we see it a lot more commonly in dogs. And it was only recently, probably in the last, I don't know, 1 or 2 years, that it started to really resonate with me that maybe this is some form of self-fecal matter transplantation, you know, that they perceive, they can smell those gut bugs, they know that they're there, or the high fiber waste that's come out of another individual, and they're trying to supplement their diet, you know, to help their own gut bugs. So it definitely is a sign that something's out of balance. Don't know if I'd go as far to say it's total ill health. You know, in dogs we might see that. We see dogs with diabetes mellitus or Cushing's, who are super hungry, eating their own poo, and if we treat the disease it goes away. In horses we don't see that as commonly, but you know, it certainly is a sign of some form of imbalance. And you know, is that at the gut bug level, is it at the fiber level? It could be either of those, and that perhaps needs investigation.
Brilliant. I love the way scientists always love to give, you know, poo eating, this complex name of coprophagia. It's great, isn't it? Well, last question, and it will be you for you, Amber, and then I'll ask Joe and you to sort of sum up. Mel's asked, I've heard of equibiome for testing some levels of bugs in the horse's gut, but are there other companies that do this testing as well? Or what company would you recommend using? Or do we know enough? I've added this bit, do we know enough to, is it worth doing?
I'm not going to say it's not worth doing. You know, it can definitely be of interest, but I think with this new piece of research from Ang that we perhaps haven't been asking the right questions. You know, we're looking for populations of bacteria that perhaps they need to be more diverse. They need to be slightly different because the free-ranging horse is different from the domestic horse. Domestic horse is impoverished, and we've got to be aware of that, really. So it's not that it isn't worth doing. But we've got to, maybe not even pinch of salt, but, you know, put it into perspective, I suppose is a good phrase. And yeah, equibiome definitely have been around for a while now. I've been offering that. I don't, you know, there are a number of laboratories which do offer something similar, which your vets will probably be able to have contact with. And you know, but I don't think they're necessarily laboratories that you can send samples to get it done purely as a guardian or caregiver yourself.
But you wouldn't, just to pick up on that, it's so important, as we've talked about tonight in the webinar, to do the basics. That's quite an advanced thing to do, isn't it? From what you're saying, actually just make sure what Joe and you have been talking about, it's so important to get the basics nailed down first. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I think it's like when people say, oh, I want to spend a load of money on a probiotic. You know, I'd be thinking, oh, do you know what, would it not be better to perhaps just invest a little bit of money in, I don't know, taking on the shared cost of another stable in the livery yard, so that you could all actually in the winter have what I would call an exploratory forage box to turn your horse out into for an hour or half an hour while you're mucking them out. You know, in there they've got some straw on the floor, and they could find some fiber nuts and, you know, some toys, and they could move around, you know, because otherwise they're just tied up while they're being mucked out, and then they're back in their box. You know, you could use that money to perhaps better effect by, you know, 4 or 5 small hay nets instead of the one that you already own. There are so many things that we could spend some money on that address the whole friends forage freedom thing, to use that at an absolute base level, rather than perhaps, you know, spending more money on testing, which probably isn't going to give us all the answers. But you know, if you've got plenty of cash and you want to do it too, there's no harm in it, for sure. It won't give us all the answers as yet, though, but I do think we're getting better and better.
And a late entry for the pun competition. It's all about thinking outside the box, is it not? There we go. Excellent. So listen, we've covered a lot as ever. Joe, what are your final thoughts to take home today?
At the risk of sounding like a broken record, just trying to meet your horse's basic behavioural needs, so the friends, food and forage, thinking about introducing any changes to anything very gradually and as stress-free as possible. And basically watch this space, because this is a really exciting, evolving area of research, and I think there's a lot more to come within the next sort of year or so. So yeah,
brilliant
for being here.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe. Amber, final thought?
Yeah, I think I often get asked, well, how, all the time with dogs and horses, how can I get their gut better? And I think, you know, time and time again, the more I've thought about it, the best thing to think about is stress reduction. and stress reduction comes in meeting their needs properly, you know, and making sure that we're reassessing the way that we train and handle horses, what we're exposing them to, you know, and if we can do that better, if we can meet their needs better and make sure the way we handle them is more compassionate, empathetic, and meets their emotional needs more effectively, that's better than anything that we can add in terms of, you know, kind of probiotics, etc.
Brilliant. Well, listen, thank you so much. Thank you very much to everyone who's answered questions. I'm really sorry we didn't get through them all, but hopefully quite a lot of similarities to the questions coming in. So hopefully you've got lots in there. Do remember, if you like this, if you've got a topic that you would like us to cover in a future webinar, email us on education@worldhorsewelfare.org. Our next webinar, they're just trying to catch me out, I think it's in 3 weeks' time. It's on the 13th of April, making an end-of-life decision. When is the right time? Very difficult subject, but a very important subject. So please do sign up, put up the chat again, the ability to sign up to that. And then just to Amber and to Joe, I mean, honestly, I have learned so much tonight. It's been fascinating. And just by the questions that are coming in and the comments we're getting back, I know it's gone down very well. So please, everyone who's listening, this will be up on our YouTube webinar education channel tonight. So please make sure, spread that around to your friends and colleagues on livery yards and anyone else who you know owns a horse, because there's so much information in tonight's webinar that really can improve the health and welfare of your horse and their quality of life. So thank you to Amber and to Joe for opening my eyes, and I know opening so many other people's eyes as well. Unfortunately, you were so good, we are definitely going to get you back. So you expect a call from Alana anytime. But thank you so much, and look after yourselves, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone in 3 weeks' time on April the 13th. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.